In the golden halls of a mighty empire, the royal family glittered with jewels, but behind the silks and crowns lay a secret no perfume could hide. Their blood, once thought pure, had become poison, twisting bodies, breaking minds, and bringing a dynasty to its knees. This is the story of how pride and bloodline destroyed a kingdom from within. Section 1. The summer of 1675 smothered the capital of Aragonia in relentless heat. Within the sprawling walls of the Alcázar de Oro, the royal palace that loomed above the city like a fortress of marble and gold, the air was heavy and unmoving. Servants fanned themselves with woven palms, courtiers dabbed their temples with lavender water, and still the air reeked of something no perfume could mask. It came from Princess Isabel of Aragonia, eldest daughter of King Hernando IV and Queen Consuela, who was, unnervingly, also his niece. Isabel was only 18, but her name had already become a whisper of discomfort through the corridors of power. She approaches, one maid would murmur to another, and suddenly the ladies would fumble for their pomanders, dousing the air with rose oil. Yet nothing could conceal the stench that followed her, a sour rot, like spoiled fish and damp stone. The court physicians called it a malady of the humors. The perfumers muttered of curses. The cooks in the kitchens whispered the truth only servants dared. It was the family blood itself. Isabel bore other signs too. Her translucent skin seemed always bruised, her dark hair fell out in clumps, and she often fainted without warning. From a shadowed alcove in the gallery, the aging court painter Don Mateo Villarroel observed her glide past. His wrinkled hands tightened around his brush. For 50 years he had painted the house of Aragonia, portraits of stern kings, dazzling queens, and children born with faces warped by their own lineage. With each generation, the features grew more severe, jaws that jutted too far, lips swollen and slack, eyes ringed with perpetual shadow. Now, with Princess Isabel, even the body itself seemed to rebel. He remembered the words of Dr. Esteban Morales, the royal physician of an earlier reign. Blood drawn too close folds upon itself, producing children weak in mind and body. To marry kin is to court decline. But Hernando IV, like his fathers before him, had ignored such counsel. Our blood must remain pure. He often declared at council. It is what makes us chosen. Yet as Isabel passed, courtiers turned their heads, holding lace to their noses. Don Mateo dipped his brush in silence. He no longer painted grandeur, he painted ghosts. Section 2. In the kitchens of the Alcázar de Oro, the heat was stifling, though the stone walls tried to hold the cool of morning. Old Dona Inés, chief cook for 3 kings now, stirred a copper cauldron filled with steaming herbs and honey. She muttered prayers beneath her breath, half to God, half to the Virgin, as she crushed rosemary and sage into the bubbling brew. This will not hide it, grumbled young Diego, the scullion boy, covering his nose with his sleeve. Dona Inés rapped his knuckles with a wooden spoon. Mind your tongue, child. That is your princess you speak of. The stench is not her fault. It is the fault of kings and their pride. The door burst open and in stormed Don Ramiro de Valcázar, high steward of the palace, red-faced and dripping sweat from his wig. Hurry, woman! The French envoy will be here within the hour, and Her Highness must be presented without shame. He pointed at the steaming cauldron. Is this the new concoction? It will mask her scent for a while, Dona Inés said carefully. But only for a while. Ramiro sniffed, grimaced, and waved his hand. Bring it to her chambers immediately. The ambassador will carry his tales back to King Louis of the Bourbons, and we cannot let them think the Princess Isabel is unfit for marriage. At the mention of marriage, Dona Inés sighed. She had served long enough to know what these alliances meant. The girl is already broken, and yet they would sell her to foreign thrones as though she were a prize mare, she thought. She ladled the steaming mixture into a silver basin, and 2 footmen lifted it carefully toward the princess's chambers. Meanwhile, beyond the kitchens, in a sunlit garden choked with the scent of wilted jasmine, a boy sat hunched in a chair too large for him. Prince Tomas, younger brother to Isabel and heir to the throne, struggled to hold open a leather-bound prayer book. His jaw jutted at an odd angle, his tongue pressed awkwardly against his teeth, and his speech came out in stammering, garbled sounds. "Read, Your Highness," urged his tutor, Father Rodrigo, sweat dripping from his brow. "Just a line more." Tomas tried. His lips trembled. The words came halting, like stones forced through a narrow stream. Finally, the boy closed the book and stared out at the other children of nobles chasing each other across the lawns. His legs, crooked from birth, ached too much for him to join them. He lowered his eyes, ashamed. Father Rodrigo whispered a prayer. Deep down, he knew the truth. Tomas would never rule as other kings had ruled. The boy's body was frail, his mind clouded, his seizures frequent. Yet the entire weight of Aragonia's empire, its colonies across the seas, its weary armies, its fading treasure, rested upon these fragile shoulders. Above them, in the high windows of the council chamber, King Hernando IV sat with his ministers. He leaned heavily against the carved oak table, his face pale, his once proud beard streaked with gray. Around him, dukes and counts murmured of debts, wars, and rebellions, but Hernando's thoughts were fixed only on his children. "Arrange a marriage for Tomas," said the Duke of Soria firmly. "He is 12 now. The line must be secured." The king closed his eyes. He knew, better than any, that his son might never sire a child. But no one in the room dared speak it. The silence pressed down, broken only by the scratching of quills and the faint toll of bells echoing across the city. Section 3. The French ambassador arrived just after noon, his carriage rattling through the palace gates under banners of crimson and gold. He was Jean-Baptiste de la Rivière, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s with a reputation for reporting every detail, no matter how cruel, back to Versailles. King Louis of France hungered for news of Aragonia's weakness, and de la Rivière was his hawk in foreign courts. Inside the Hall of Mirrors, courtiers fanned themselves and shifted uncomfortably, awaiting the moment. Perfumed braziers smoked along the walls, an almost desperate attempt to drown out the presence of Princess Isabel. At last, the chamberlain announced her. The doors opened. Isabel entered in a gown of pale blue silk threaded with silver. Her jewels glittered, her powdered skin gleamed, and she walked with a dignity drilled into her since childhood. But the room still shifted as she passed, courtiers subtly pressing lace handkerchiefs to their noses, their eyes flickering toward the ambassador with nervous calculation. De la Rivière bowed low, hiding the faint wrinkle of his nose. "Your Highness," he said in smooth Castilian, "France is honored to look upon so radiant a flower of Aragonia." Isabel's throat tightened. She had heard enough whispers to know what was really said of her. Still, she forced a smile. "And Aragonia is honored to receive you, monsieur. May our houses flourish in peace." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled within her sleeves. Every step, every breath, was an act of defiance against her own body. She prayed she would not faint as she had before. From the side of the hall, Don Mateo Villaroel, the court painter, sketched quickly, capturing the tension of the moment. He noted the stiffness in Isabel's posture, the way the ambassador's eyes lingered not with admiration but with scrutiny. They will send word to Louis tonight, he thought bitterly. And he will laugh in his gilded halls, for he knows our bloodline rots before his very eyes. Later, when the ambassador was gone and the hall emptied, Isabel collapsed onto a velvet chair in her chambers. Her maid, Leonore, rushed to her side with a damp cloth. "My lady, you must rest." "I cannot," Isabel whispered, tears filling her eyes. "They all look at me as though I am a corpse that walks. And yet they would have me married, sent abroad like a prize goat. Do they not see what I am?" Leonore hesitated. She wanted to comfort her mistress, but no words came. In truth, Isabel was right. Her body betrayed her with every breath. Meanwhile, in the council chamber, King Hernando IV listened as his ministers whispered urgently about the ambassador's visit. "He will return to France with reports," said the Duke of Soria grimly. "Reports of weakness. We must move swiftly, sire. Secure alliances while we still can. And what alliance will accept a son who cannot speak clearly, or a daughter who stinks of decay?" Hernando snapped, slamming his hand on the table. His voice cracked with something between rage and despair. No one answered. The silence stretched, heavy as stone. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The house of Aragonia was crumbling, not from war or rebellion, but from within its own veins. And outside, in the gardens, Prince Tomas stared at the healthy noble children running beneath the orange trees. He pressed his hand against the glass of the window, a longing look in his dark eyes, as though he could touch the world he was never truly allowed to join. Section 4. That night, the palace did not sleep. The heat pressed against the walls like a suffocating blanket, and the hum of cicadas filled the gardens. In her chamber, Princess Isabel lay awake beneath gauzy curtains, her body shivering despite the warmth. The herbal bath had faded, the smell returned, sour and damp, clinging to her sheets. She buried her face in her pillow, ashamed, though no one else was there to smell it. A soft knock came at the door. It was her younger brother, Prince Tomas, leaning awkwardly on a cane. His nurse trailed behind him, wringing her hands. Isa, Tomas stammered, his large tongue making the syllables thick. Are you ill? She rose, gathering her robe around her thin shoulders. I am fine, hermano, she whispered. Why are you not asleep? He looked down, embarrassed, his legs trembling beneath his small frame. Nightmares, he mumbled. Isabel pulled him into her bed and wrapped her arms around him. His body was fragile, bird-like yet hot with fever. She brushed his tangled hair from his forehead. Do not fear. I am here. For a while they lay in silence, the brother and sister bound not just by blood, but by the strange curse of their lineage. Isabel knew, with the clarity of despair, that he would never grow into the king the ministers pretended he could be. And she would never be the bride they wanted her to be. They were broken children of a broken crown. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, King Hernando paced his study alone. The candles burned low, wax dripping onto the maps of empire sprawled across his desk. His reflection in the tall mirror showed a gaunt man with hollow eyes. He remembered his wedding to Consuela, his niece, arranged after the death of his first wife. It had been called a union of purity, a safeguard for dynastic strength. But as Hernando thought of Isabel's fainting fits and Tomas's twisted legs, a heavy guilt pressed on him like iron. God forgive me, he muttered, gripping the crucifix on the wall. I thought I was securing my house. Instead, I have doomed it. At dawn, the bells of Santa Aurelia tolled across the city, summoning the royal family to Mass. The king walked stiffly beside his wife, Queen Consuela, whose face was as pale and sharp as a blade. Behind them came Isabel and Tomas, struggling to keep pace, their bodies weary from the night. Inside the cathedral, incense filled the air, heavy and sweet. Father Rodrigo intoned prayers for the health of the royal line, his voice echoing through the vaulted nave. But whispers still rustled in the pews, carried among the noble families. The princess reeks like a corpse. The prince cannot even read. What will become of Aragonia when Hernando dies? Dona Elvira, an elderly noblewoman, leaned close to her granddaughter. Mark my words, she hissed. This house will not last another generation. God himself has turned his face from them. The girl shushed her, but deep down, she believed it too. When the mass ended, the family processed out in silence, their jewels glinting in the sun. The crowd bowed low, but in their hearts they did not cheer. They watched their rulers with pity, and with fear of what would come after. The once mighty crown of Aragonia was beginning to look less like a gift from God, and more like a curse. Section 5. By late summer, the Alcazar buzzed with rumors of betrothal. The council had decided, Princess Isabel must be offered in marriage to strengthen Aragonia's position against its enemies. The French envoy had written scathing reports, and whispers suggested King Louis of France was already scheming for the day Aragonia's throne fell vacant. But to whom could Isabel be married? Suitors had been suggested, an Austrian archduke, a Portuguese prince, even a distant Italian cousin. Yet none were eager. Word of her condition spread faster than any formal proposal. In the salons of Europe, Isabel's name became a cruel joke, a tale told with wrinkled noses and muffled laughter. Still, the council pressed. One evening, the queen herself entered her daughter's chambers. Queen Consuelo was as rigid as the gilt frame of a portrait, her dark eyes lined with fatigue. "Isabel," she said, her voice cold but steady, "you will meet the envoy of Naples tomorrow. He comes to judge your worth." Isabel froze. "My worth?" Consuela's lips tightened. "You are a princess of Aragonia. Your duty is to the bloodline, not to your comfort. You will wear the emerald gown. You will smile. And you will not disgrace this family with weakness." Tears burned Isabel's eyes, but she lowered her head. "Yes, Madre." When the queen left, Leonore, her maid, approached carefully. "Do you wish me to prepare the perfumes, Highness?" Isabel laughed bitterly. "As if rose water could drown out the rot in my blood." She touched her own wrist, where veins showed through translucent skin. "Sometimes I think God placed this curse upon me so that our family might finally see the truth. But still they refuse." The next day, Isabel was dressed and powdered until her skin resembled porcelain. She was seated in the Hall of Lions, where fountains murmured and mosaics gleamed, awaiting the envoy. Don Fabrizio of Naples entered, a tall man with a hawk-like nose and calculating eyes. He bowed, kissed her hand, and forced a smile. The moment he drew close, his nostrils flared ever so slightly. He covered it with a cough, but Isabel saw. She always saw. They spoke of music, of gardens, of politics. She answered with grace, every word careful, though her palms sweated beneath her gloves. At the end, Don Fabrizio bowed again, muttering compliments about her beauty, her wit, her grace. But that evening, Isabel overheard her mother whispering to the king. "He will decline," Consuela said. "He saw what all men see." The king groaned, burying his face in his hands. "Then what remains for her? Shall we lock her in a convent?" Isabel's breath caught. She pressed her hand against the wall, her heart racing. Was that to be her fate, hidden away, forgotten, while her body withered and her bloodline collapsed? In another wing of the palace, Prince Tomas endured another seizure. His tutor knelt beside him, terrified, as the boy convulsed and moaned. By the time it passed, Tomas lay limp, his lips blue, his chest rising shallowly. "Sweet Christ," Father Rodrigo whispered. "How can this boy be king?" The servants carried him to bed, and for hours he did not wake. That same night, thunder rolled over the city. Lightning split the skies, and the palace shook with the storm. From her chamber window, Isabel watched the rain lash the stones, and she thought of her brother. "Neither of us will save this crown," she realized. "We are the storm that ends it." Section 6. Autumn fell heavy upon Aragonia, the skies gray with storms, the streets of the capital thick with mud. Inside the Alcazar, preparations continued for the feast of Saint Aurelio, a ceremony meant to display the glory of the dynasty. Banners were unfurled, musicians rehearsed, and tapestries depicting victories of old were hung along the marble halls. But even as the palace glittered with borrowed splendor, beneath it all lay unease. Whispers of Isabel's failed betrothal had spread, and the court now pinned its hopes on young Prince Tomas. He alone was the future, fragile though he was. The boy, now 13, was paraded before the court in polished boots and a crimson doublet, his crooked legs strapped with braces of iron to keep him upright. Courtiers bowed deeply as he limped into the great hall, supported by 2 attendants. From the galleries, nobles watched with solemn eyes. Some crossed themselves, others turned away in discomfort. The king, Hernando IV, sat upon his throne, his features drawn, his gaze hollow. He forced a smile for his son. "Behold, the heir of Aragonia," he announced, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Applause followed, but it was hesitant, scattered, like raindrops on stone. Even Tomas seemed to feel the hollowness. His cheeks flushed red, and he clutched the railing of the dais with trembling hands. Later that evening, in the council chamber, Hernando's ministers pressed him again. "Sire, we must secure a marriage for the prince. It matters not that he is young. The succession must be safeguarded." The king's temper snapped. You speak as though arranging a marriage will heal his body. Do you not see him? The boy struggles to stand, his tongue betrays him, his very bones betray him. Would you sell him off to some foreign princess and call it salvation? The Duke of Soria bowed his head but spoke carefully. Better to sell him than to lose everything when your majesty passes. The words pierced Hernando like a blade. He dismissed the council with a wave of his trembling hand. Alone, he stared at the flickering candles and muttered, "Perhaps God has cursed us all." Meanwhile, Isabel sat by her brother's side in his chambers. Tomas lay propped against pillows, his body exhausted from the day's display. His eyes fluttered open when she touched his hand. They stared at me, he mumbled, his voice thick. Like I was a monster. You are not a monster, Isabel said firmly, though her throat tightened. You are my brother. You are a prince. He looked at her with sad, knowing eyes. But not a king. She had no answer. She smoothed his hair, her heart breaking. She saw it clearly now, the truth the council refused to say aloud. Their dynasty was not merely weakened. It was dying. And no matter how many jewels they wore or banners they raised, the world could smell the rot beneath. As the feast of St. Aurelio approached, thunder rolled across the city once more, like a drumbeat of doom. The palace shone with gold and silk, but in its halls, fear stalked like a shadow, whispering of the end to come. Section 7. The feast of St. Aurelio arrived with fanfare. Bells tolled from every church tower in the capital, their echoes rolling over the rooftops. Crowds gathered along the avenues to watch the royal procession, eager for a glimpse of their sovereigns. For many of the common folk, such spectacles were the only moments when they felt near to the power that ruled their lives. Inside the Alcazar, Princess Isabel endured the careful torment of preparation. Her maids powdered her skin until her cheeks burned, pinned her dark hair with pearls, and layered her gown with embroidered silk. All the while, the perfumers circled her like priests at a ritual, spraying her with orange blossom water and burning sweet-smelling resins. But still, beneath it all, the odor lingered, faint but inescapable, like damp earth after a flood. She caught her reflection in the gilded mirror, a queenly figure wrapped in splendor, and yet her eyes betrayed the truth, hollow, frightened, weary. They will not remember the jewels, she whispered to Leonore, her maid. They will remember the smell. Down the corridor, Prince Tomas was being readied. 2 pages tightened the iron braces around his crooked legs, while his nurse dabbed his lips with balm to cover the cracks. He winced at every buckle, but said nothing. When at last he was dressed in white velvet trimmed with gold, he looked less like a boy and more like a porcelain doll, fragile and too easily broken. The royal family entered the cathedral in solemn procession. Incense swirled, candles flickered, and the choir's voices lifted high into the vaulted arches. King Hernando, bent with age and guilt, leaned heavily on his staff as he walked beside Queen Consuela. Behind them came Isabel, her head held high though her heart trembled, and Tomas, stumbling with every step, his attendants clutching him by the arms. The nobles filled the pews, their eyes sharp, their whispers sharper. Dona Elvira, the old noblewoman, clutched her rosary and hissed to her granddaughter, "Look at them! A house of wax figures, melting before our eyes. God shows his judgment, child, he shows it plain." At the altar, the archbishop raised his hands and declared blessings for the prosperity of the royal bloodline. His voice echoed through the nave, but the congregation listened in silence, their prayers tinged with doubt. For all their riches, for all their ceremony, the royal family seemed more cursed than blessed. After the Mass, the feast began in the palace. Long tables overflowed with roasted boar, gilded fruits, and spiced wines. Musicians played, dancers spun, courtiers laughed too loudly, forcing merriment into the air. Yet beneath the glittering masks of celebration, unease spread like smoke. Everyone saw how Prince Tomas struggled to keep food in his mouth, how his tongue pushed awkwardly against his teeth, how his jaw trembled when he tried to speak. Everyone noticed how Princess Isabel slipped away early, pale and sweating, her maids trailing behind her with bowls of herbs. And Hernando, seated at the high table, watched it all with a sick heart. His hand trembled on the golden goblet, his mind echoing with one thought: the blood that was meant to preserve us is the very poison that will destroy us. The feast ended with fireworks bursting over the city, but for the people of Aragonia, the display only lit more clearly what they already feared. Their dynasty was a candle burning low, its flame guttering in the wind. Section 8. The weeks following the feast were heavy with silence. Court life carried on, masks, hunting parties, endless councils, but beneath the rituals ran an undercurrent of dread. Everyone waited for news of a betrothal, a treaty, a sign that the dynasty's decline might be reversed. Instead, there came only rumors. It was whispered that the Neapolitan envoy had declined Isabel's hand with polite excuses, that the Austrian Archduke had sent word he was already promised elsewhere, that the Portuguese prince had suffered a sudden illness the moment her name was mentioned. None of these refusals were announced officially, of course. They seeped into the palace like water through cracked stone. Isabel felt every whisper as if it were a dagger. One morning, after a particularly cruel comment overheard from two young ladies of the court, her stench could drive a groom from the altar, she fled into the gardens. She found refuge in the small orange grove near the fountain, where the air was thick with blossoms. There she collapsed onto a marble bench, pressing her face into her hands. Don Mateo Villarroel, the court painter, discovered her there. He had been sketching the fountains when he saw her trembling form. Slowly, respectfully, he approached. "My lady," he said softly, "forgive my intrusion." She raised her head, her eyes red. "Do you too see me as they do, Don Mateo? As a burden dressed in silk?" The old painter bowed his head. "I see a princess who bears the weight of sins not her own. It is not your fault that your blood was twisted before you were born." Isabel stared at him. "Then whose fault is it?" He hesitated. The words he wanted to say, "your father's, your mother's, your ancestors'," were too dangerous. Instead, he answered, "It is the fault of pride. Pride that defies God's order, pride that binds kin where strangers should be joined." She looked at the painter with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. "You are the first to speak to me with truth," she whispered, "even if truth is cruel." In another wing of the palace, Tomas suffered another fit during lessons. He convulsed until his lips turned blue, his tutor crying for help. Servants rushed in, carrying the boy to his bed, his limbs twitching like broken strings. When the seizure passed, Tomas lay limp, his eyes half open, his breath shallow. Queen Consuela hovered over him, her face stiff with fear. "Summon the physicians," she commanded. They came in haste, bearing jars of leeches, powders of antimony, and draughts of bitter herbs. One suggested bleeding, another insisted on a purgative. Yet all their remedies brought little relief. That evening, Hernando Four stood by his son's bedside, watching the boy sleep fitfully. He felt the sting of tears, rare for a king who had once led armies. "How will you rule, my son, when you cannot even walk without pain?" he whispered. The queen's voice was sharp as steel. "He will rule because he must. God placed him in the cradle of kings, and there he shall remain." Hernando turned to her, his jaw tight. "And if God placed him there to show us the folly of our pride?" Consuela's eyes flashed. "Blasphemy. Our line is chosen. It will endure." But as she spoke, thunder rumbled once more over the city, as though heaven itself disagreed. Section 9. Winter descended upon Aragonia, a damp, bone-deep chill that seeped into the very stones of the Alcazar. Fires blazed in every hearth, yet draughts whispered through the corridors, carrying with them the faint scent of mildew and decay. To many in the court, it felt as though the palace itself was rotting along with the dynasty it housed. Princess Isabel grew paler as the cold set in. Her fainting fits became more frequent, her lips trembled even in stillness. The perfumers worked day and night, layering her chamber with resins, musk, and rose oils, but their efforts were in vain. The smell always returned, sour and clinging, as though it came not from her body but from her very blood. One evening, after collapsing during vespers, Isabel was carried to her bed. A cluster of courtiers lingered outside her chamber door, murmuring. Don Ramiro, the high steward, hissed at them to disperse, but not before Isabel heard one of the whispers drift in through the crack. Better she be cloistered than wed. Who would bed a corpse that reeks? She turned her face to the wall and wept. Meanwhile, Prince Tomas grew thinner, his body stretched too far by pain. He walked less now, relying on attendants to carry him from chamber to chamber. Yet his mind, though clouded, stirred with sudden bursts of clarity. One night, Isabel found him awake, staring at the ceiling beams. "Sister," he said haltingly, his tongue thick but his eyes sharp. "Why must we marry at all? Why must we give children to this cursed blood?" Isabel sat beside him, stroking his hand. "Because it is our duty." "But what if duty is wrong?" His voice cracked with both weakness and a strange, desperate strength. "What if God does not want our blood to continue?" Her heart ached. She had thought the same in her darkest hours, but never dared say it aloud. She kissed his forehead. "Rest, Tomas. You think too much." In truth, she feared he thought too clearly. At council, the ministers grew restless. Reports arrived daily from abroad, France strengthening its armies, Portugal whispering of alliances, Austria circling like a vulture. The Empire of Aragonia, once vast and unyielding, now stood on trembling legs, just like the boy who was meant to inherit it. "We must secure him a bride," insisted the Duke of Soria, slamming his hand on the table. "Even if he cannot father children, the attempt must be made. We cannot show weakness to the world." King Hernando's voice was hollow. "And when she discovers the truth? When she realizes she has married a boy who cannot sire an heir?" The council fell silent. They had no answer. That night, Hernando wandered the royal library, its shelves heavy with chronicles of past kings. He touched the leather spines, tales of victories, marriages, dynasties secured through cunning and blood. All undone by our pride, he thought. We thought ourselves eternal, but we are only men, and men die. As he lingered there, Father Rodrigo entered quietly. The priest bowed, then said softly, "Sire, perhaps it is not a curse. Perhaps it is a warning." Hernando looked at him sharply. "Speak plainly." Rodrigo's voice was low. "The book tells us that pride goes before the fall. For generations your house has defied the natural order. Uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, God does not bless such unions forever. Perhaps he shows us now that the line must end." The king trembled, clutching a volume to his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt not only the weight of a crown, but the certainty that it would fall. Section 10. Spring of 1683 brought no renewal. The orchards outside Madrid bloomed, yet within the Alcázar de Oro, the house of Aragonia withered. Princess Isabel, frail beyond her years, was confined to her chamber more often than not. Her fainting became so common that courtiers no longer gasped when she collapsed. They merely stepped aside, letting her ladies rush in with salts and herbs. Prince Tomas fared no better. At 15, he looked no older than a boy of 10. His jaw had grown more misshapen, his seizures more violent. One evening, after a particularly brutal convulsion, his physicians confessed privately to the king. "Sire, it is unlikely he will see his 20th year." Hernando foresaid nothing. He merely stared into the hearth, his hands trembling in his lap. The court no longer pretended to optimism. Nobles whispered of succession in hushed corners, of foreign claimants, of the vultures circling Aragonia's throne. France sharpened its claws, Austria plotted, Portugal schemed. The great empire of the West, spanning oceans, glittering with gold, balanced on the breath of a dying boy and a daughter too frail to stand. One evening, Isabel asked her father to walk with her in the gardens. Supported by Leonor, she moved slowly beneath the orange trees, their blossoms heavy with fragrance. Hernando, stooped and weary, followed with his cane. "Father," she said softly, "do you regret it?" He frowned. "Regret what, child?" "The marriages. The unions that chained us to ourselves." She paused, the scent of blossoms mixing with the faint rot she carried. Did you ever think of what it might do to us? Hernando closed his eyes. For years he had buried the guilt. But now, looking at his daughter, beautiful and broken, he could not lie. Every day, he whispered. Isabel took his hand, fragile as glass. Then promise me one thing. When Tomas and I are gone, do not bind the crown again to kin. Let it pass, even if it means to strangers. Let our curse end with us. Her father's grip tightened, and for the first time in many years, tears spilled freely down his cheeks. That autumn, the prophecy fulfilled itself. Isabel succumbed to fever, her body too weak to fight. The court shrouded her in silk, the air thick with incense to cover the scent of decay. But no perfume could hide the truth, the bloodline was ending. 3 years later, Tomas followed. His body failed him in the night, his breath fluttering once and then stopping altogether. He was 17. When the bells tolled, the city wept, though many also sighed with grim acceptance. The once mighty house of Aragonia had extinguished itself, not by war, not by rebellion, but by its own hand. Centuries of pride, of marriages bound too close, had wound the bloodline into a knot too tight to breathe. Hernando IV died soon after, broken in body and spirit. His will named no heir of his blood. Instead, it placed the crown upon the head of a foreign prince. A Bourbon, descended not from Aragonia's line but from the rival house of France. When the proclamation was read, the court fell silent. Some raged, others wept. Yet all understood. The dynasty of Aragonia was finished. Years later, in quiet halls, courtiers would remember the last days. The princess who carried the scent of rot, the boy king who could not walk, the king who lived long enough to see his house collapse. And historians would write what the people already knew: that the proudest blood in Christendom had undone itself. That crowns do not defy nature forever. That empires fall not only by sword or fire, but by the silence of their own dying veins. And so the house of Aragonia passed into history, leaving only portraits in gilt frames, faces with jutting jaws, sunken eyes, and vacant stares. Reminders of what happens when men mistake blood for eternity.